Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the raw, damp air of a Scandinavian evening where the fjords slice into the land like jagged fingers and farms cling to the cliffs with a stubbornness that feels almost human. You hear the slap of water against the rocky shore and the faint clatter of wooden tools being tucked away. It's not the raid horn that keeps your pulse on edge here, but the low rumble of cattle in their pens, shadows swaying against the torchlight. You probably won't survive this, because one slip on a muddy slope or one angry bull deciding you're in the wrong place at the wrong time could end your saga before it ever begins. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time below. I love knowing where and when you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge up the slope, boots sucking into the wet soil, and notice how everything about Viking farming life feels more precarious than those romanticized raid stories. Sure, sagas talk of longships slicing through the sea, but here at the edge of the fjord, survival depends on a single thing: keeping your cows alive. Each animal is a living vault of wealth, milk, meat, hide, labor, and each one carries as much risk as reward. The fjord air cuts sharply, salty and metallic, and you can smell the barns long before you reach them: sour hay, manure, and the slightly sweet tang of fermenting silage. The cows shift restlessly, their hooves clicking on stone, and for a moment you realize just how fragile this whole operation is. One bad winter, one outbreak, one bull with a mean streak, and the family tethered to this farm is doomed. Historians still argue whether Viking expansion across seas was spurred more by greed for silver or sheer hunger, when herds collapsed in lean years. Either way, your glorious raiding ships look less like choice and more like necessity. You duck beneath the eaves of a low-roofed longhouse, its timbers thick with smoke stains. Inside, families and livestock share the same air. This isn't the cozy, candlelit lodge you might imagine. It's cramped, smoky, and buzzing with fleas. The cows stand tethered along one wall, steaming in the chill. Children weave between them as though weaving through chairs, while mothers churn butter in the dim light. It sounds quaint until a startled kick sends someone sprawling. Jokes aside, medieval health and safety officers would have lost their minds here, but still there's a certain rhythm to it. You hear the lull of milk pails filling, the rhythmic grunt of someone splitting logs outside, and the ever-present drip of melted snow from the roof. You notice how the fjord cliffs glow with twilight, the last orange streak swallowed by a blue so deep it feels like the sea has risen into the sky. It's not beauty that anchors people here, though. It's obligation. If you leave the cows untended, you starve. If you stay and tend them, you might get trampled. Choose your danger wisely. One mainstream historical fact to ground this scene: archaeology shows that Viking farms in Norway and Iceland often clustered precariously close to fjords because flat land was so scarce. These farms weren't sprawling estates. They were carved wedges of usable soil, terraces wrestled from the mountain. Every stone wall was a declaration: here we farm, no matter how impossible. And you, dragging hay by hand, can't help but laugh quietly at the thought that raiding was considered the easy option. For a quirky tidbit, consider this. Some sagas describe cows being led up impossible slopes to graze on mountain herbs, and occasionally, yes, falling off cliffs. Imagine explaining that to your neighbors. Oh, you lost a brother to the sea? I lost a cow to gravity. As you sit near the barn door, the low fog rolls in, curling between fence posts and soaking your wool cloak. It's heavy, quiet, and oppressive. You hear a snort from the biggest bull in the herd, a warning deep and rumbling, and suddenly you feel very small. The sea raiders are out there somewhere, yes, but in this fjord valley, the real peril towers above you, chewing cud in the dark. One more thought to leave you with before we step further into the story. Historians still argue whether these fjord farms were sustainable at all, or if they were always a gamble, a constant tightrope walk above starvation. Some say the Viking Age itself was less a golden adventure, and more the collective result of farmers finally saying, "Forget this, let's sail." You glance back at the glowing strip of horizon, then at the restless cattle shifting in their stalls. Tonight your story doesn't begin on the prow of a longship. It begins here among steaming beasts and creaking timbers, where survival has sharper horns than any raid. You wake in the heavy darkness of the longhouse, the kind of dark that presses against your eyelids even though your eyes are open. The air is thick with the scent of dung, smoke, and sour milk. Somewhere to your left, a cow shifts, the tether creaking, and the wooden beams above groan as if the whole house is breathing. You realize quickly, here in this strange Viking world, the shadows cast by cattle weigh heavier on your mind than any dream of raids across the sea. You push yourself up from the straw bed, brushing crumbs of hay from your cloak, and peer at the horned silhouettes along the wall. Even in the dim glow of the hearth, their bodies loom vast, their snorts rumbling like muffled thunder. You think of raiders with axes and helmets, but the truth is, raiders only come once in a while. These animals? They are here every day, every night, and every second of your life depends on them behaving themselves. You might as well fear your own shadow less than the sharp swing of a horn. You shuffle outside into the pre-dawn chill, mist rising off the fjord, the water gleaming like steel. Across the slope another farmstead clings to the mountainside, smoke threading into the sky. You hear the low calls of herders already stirring their animals. For a moment you marvel at the scale of it. Whole families revolving around the moods of cows, milk to drink, butter to churn, hides to tan. And yet, with all that dependency comes dread. Because when the herd stirs angry, it's not wealth standing in front of you. It's a wall of muscle and bone that can flatten a person faster than a sword fight ever could. One mainstream historical fact here: written sources like the Icelandic sagas often treat cattle as the true currency of Viking life. Silver and plunder might glitter in poems, but in practical terms wealth was measured in cows. A family's status, marriage prospects, and ability to survive winter hinged on how many healthy cattle they could keep alive. Raiders might steal treasure. Neighbors envied your herd, and you know what? You can't shake the sense that those neighbors were scarier than the foreign raiders too. Quarrels over pastures, accusations of stolen calves, arguments about breeding rights. Those disputes sparked more local feuds than foreign invasions ever did. Historians still argue whether Viking law codes exaggerated cattle disputes, or whether cows really were at the heart of most lawsuits, but the sheer number of references to hoof prints in medieval legal texts makes you wonder if the sagas just wrote down what everyone already knew. Cows caused chaos. As you wander back toward the barn, you catch a glimpse of a young boy trying to coax a calf to drink. The calf, stubborn as a mule, refuses, and the boy ends up with a face full of spilled milk. You can't help but smirk. Small comedy in a life otherwise weighed down by real peril. A sleepy elder nearby mutters that it's a bad omen, and you suddenly remember one quirky tidbit. Some Viking farmers believed that if a cow kicked over its milk pail on a holy day, it wasn't just clumsiness. it was a sign the gods themselves were displeased. Imagine carrying that superstition every time you bent over with a bucket. Talk about performance anxiety. You step into the cowshed again, and the soundscape overwhelms you. The dripping of melted snow into troughs, the restless stamping of hooves, the occasional hiss of breath through flared nostrils. You look around and think, if these cows vanish, so does the farm. Without them, there's no butter to trade at market, no leather to barter, no bones to carve into tools. That's not fear you're feeling. It's all tangled with dread, the way you'd feel standing too close to the sea in a storm. But the strange truth, the Viking farmer's world revolved around anticipating disaster, not if, but when. You might fear raids, but they were distant. You might fear storms at sea, but you rarely went sailing. The real fear was the daily question, will the cow drop dead? Will the fodder run out? Will a bull decide today's the day he teaches you who's boss? It's a fear woven into every chore, every ritual, every breath of farm life. And speaking of rituals, you overhear a whispered prayer from the farmer's wife as she sprinkles salt over a trough. It's not dramatic, a simple plea that the cows eat well, grow fat, and stay fertile. You realize these animals are not just beasts, they're tethered to the very idea of survival, so much so that spiritual life wraps around them like ivy on stone. You remember from earlier sagas that the gods themselves were fed on the milk of a cosmic cow. If divine beings drank it, who are you to take it lightly? You glance toward the fjord again, that steel-grey mirror, and wonder how many stories never made it into the sagas. How many lives ended not by an axe, but by a cow's horn, a trampling hoof, or starvation when a herd collapsed. The unromantic truth settles heavy in your chest. The shadow of cattle, vast and ever-present, stretched further across Viking lives than the shadow of raids ever did. And yet, even as you chew on that thought, you can't help but grin at the irony. Raiders were the celebrities, the rock stars of their age, but the real headliners, the ones you'd never dare cross, were chewing cud in the barn. Fame is fleeting. Fear is daily. The morning light slants weakly through the cracks in the timber walls, painting thin golden stripes across the churn and the shelves of clay bowls. You shuffle into the dairy room, or, more accurately, a smoky corner of the longhouse where the magic of milk takes place. Here the true Viking alchemy happens. Forget turning iron into gold. Turning milk into something that won't poison you is the real trick. And as you stand there, sniffing the sour tang in the air, you realize just how delicate, risky, and frankly gross this process can be. A wooden churn squats in the center, and beside it sits a half-filled bucket of milk, still warm from the cow. The surface already has a thin skin, a reminder that refrigeration is centuries away. You watch a woman stir the bucket with a carved wooden ladle, her arm moving with weary precision. Her whole life depends on this skill. If the milk goes bad too fast, if it curdles the wrong way, the family goes hungry. And yes, you might laugh about spilling milk now, but here, one wasted pail could mean starvation. Suddenly that phrase, "Don't cry over spilled milk," sounds less like advice and more like cruel mockery. You lean closer to the churn and hear the sloshing rhythm of buttermilk turning. Butter is gold here, not just for spreading on bread but for trading across seas. Archaeologists have found Viking butter sealed in wooden barrels, preserved in bogs for centuries, as if the earth itself knew to hold on to such treasure. That's your mainstream fact. Bog butter really existed, sometimes hidden as offerings, sometimes simply buried to keep it edible. Imagine digging through mud and finding a 1,000-year-old stick of butter. Suddenly your toast feels a little less appetizing, and then comes the quirky tidbit. Viking farmers sometimes used animal stomachs, rennet inside and all, to help milk curdle into cheese. You're basically pouring milk into a bag of enzymes harvested from a calf's stomach lining. Delicious, right? You wonder if anyone back then ever admitted out loud, "Hey, this seems kind of gross," or if they just shrugged and said, "Well, it works and we're starving, so down the hatch." The air in the dairy corner grows heavy, pungent with a mix of sweet cream and sour clapper. You wrinkle your nose, but you also understand why raiding tales got so popular. Longships, axes, feasts, those are glamorous. Describing the fine art of not dying from spoiled dairy. Not exactly bedtime saga material. And yet here you are, wide awake in the middle of it, realizing that one slip-up in the dairy room is deadlier than an ambush on the beach. Historians still argue whether Viking farmers deliberately fermented milk into skyer, the Icelandic yogurt-like staple, or if it was mostly an accidental byproduct of storage in wooden tubs. Either way, you picture some poor soul taking the first bite and deciding against all odds that this sour, tangy sludge was actually edible. And then you picture their neighbor saying, "Well, if you mix it with berries, it's not that bad." Congratulations, you've just invented breakfast. You glance at the shelves lined with clay pots, their rims crusted with dried residue. Every container is both hope and hazard. Milk left too long turns sour. Sour milk left even longer might become drinkable again if you're lucky, or lethal if you're not. And there's no thermometer here, no neat chart saying store at 4 degrees Celsius. Just instinct, taste, and the occasional tragedy. The farmers' children peek in, their mouths white with milk froth, and you can't help but smile at the scene. But even that innocence carries risk. A child might gulp down a cup of milk, only to collapse with cramps later, the family whispering about curses or bad luck. You know better, it's bacteria, but in this dim longhouse with smoke curling and cows lowing outside, the line between science and superstition blurs. You step closer to the churn, run your hand along the smooth wood polished by years of use, and suddenly imagine the rhythm. Hour after hour, day after day, families repeating this same motion, whispering prayers that the butter sets properly, that the cheese firms instead of rotting. It's not heroism with a sword, it's endurance with a spoon. And yet, amid all this risk, there's a strange comfort. The repetitive thump of the churn, the crackle of the fire, the steady beat of chores, all of it creates a rhythm that keeps the chaos at bay. Raids might tear through a coastline, but the real war is fought here against time, rot, and the invisible enemies lurking in every drop of milk. So when you hear the phrase, "Vikings feared their cows more than raids," you laugh softly now, because you understand. Raids were an interruption, cows were a constant, and milk, that fragile, slippery substance, was either salvation in a clay jar or a quiet execution waiting on the shelf. You step back toward the doorway, letting the cold fjord air clear your head. Outside, the herd shifts, lowing impatiently. Inside, the butter-churn keeps beating like a drum of survival. You realize with a shiver, this isn't a side story. This is the Viking saga, one that smells faintly of sour milk and sounds like the endless thump of a churn. The wind knifes down from the mountain ridge, slicing through your cloak as you trudge toward the barn. Inside, the cows shuffle restlessly, their breath steaming in the frosty dawn. You've learned quickly that winter isn't about surviving cold, it's about surviving hunger. And not just your hunger, but theirs. The real gamble of Viking life sits right here in the rafters, stacked in scratchy bundles, hay and fodder, a year's worth of hope drying above your head. You climb the ladder to the loft, the rungs worn smooth, and peer into the hay piled like golden mountains. For now it looks plentiful, but you know the math never feels generous. Every mouthful the cows take is a calculation. Will the hay last until spring grass returns? Or will you face the slow dread of dwindling fodder while snow still blankets? The fields. Historians still argue whether Viking farmers practiced efficient crop rotation or simply prayed that their hay meadows would bounce back each year. Archaeological soil samples suggest fields often wore out quickly, forcing farmers to clear new ground or fight neighbors for better pastures. The evidence points to a constant dance between cultivation and exhaustion. And you, standing here in the loft, realize that the true battlefield isn't across the sea. It's the meadow outside your door. You grab a handful of hay and sniff it, sweet, dry, with a faint, earthy note. If it smells musty, it means mold has crept in, and mold means death. Not just for cows, but for the family who drinks their milk or eats their meat. One bad bale can take down half the herd. You suddenly understand why families guarded hay stores like treasure chests. Forget gold. This is life stacked under a timber roof. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Some medieval farmers, not just in Scandinavia but across Europe, tested hay quality by chewing it themselves. If it crunched pleasantly and didn't taste sour, it was safe. Imagine chewing hay as if you were reviewing a fine wine. Ah yes, 875 was a good harvest. Notes of clover and desperation. You descend the ladder, hearing the restless shuffling of hooves below. A calf bawls hungrily, tugging against its tether, and the sound cuts straight through you. You can almost feel the farmer's dilemma. Feed the calf more now and risk running, out of fodder later, or ration it harshly and gamble on survival. You realize that this is what management really means here. Not planning raids, but deciding who eats and how much. The barn feels smaller with each step, the walls pressing in, as though the fear of scarcity is a physical weight. You picture a family huddled in midwinter, snow drifting against the doors, hay bales shrinking each day, children whispering, mothers counting handfuls, fathers praying the herd makes it through. The longhouse might echo with laughter and song, but underneath every feast lies the nervous question, do we still have enough for the cows? One mainstream historical fact: written laws in medieval Iceland explicitly set fines for stealing hay. It wasn't just theft, it was sabotage. Taking hay from a neighbor could doom an entire herd, and by extension an entire family. So courts treated it as seriously as stealing silver or land. A man could start a blood feud over hay, and no one would laugh. You watch as the farmer's wife trudges past with a basket of dried leaves and twigs, emergency fodder. Yes, when hay runs out, desperate farmers turn to birch leaves, seaweed, or even fish heads to stretch the feed. You picture cows chewing kelp dragged from the fjord, looking thoroughly unimpressed. And you laugh softly, because even the cows seem to know this isn't food, just survival in disguise. As the day wears on, the barn fills with the dusty smell of hay, the soft tearing of mouths chewing, the steady rhythm of animal life. And yet, behind every sound lurks anxiety. You hear a neighbor shouting down the slope, arguing about meadow boundaries, his words sharp as an axe. It strikes you then. The hayfield is not just a place of labor, it's a place of rivalry, where survival rubs shoulders with envy. You step back outside into the pale light, the fjord glittering below. The fields look barren now, but in summer they'll bloom, and the gamble will start again. Every season is a coin toss, every winter a test. The raids that fill sagas were daring, yes, but the hay harvest was the true high-stakes adventure. and as you pull your cloak tighter, you realize something chilling. No matter how well you plan, no matter how carefully you ration, there's always a chance the fodder won't last. Winter is a relentless gambler, and in this game the cows always hold the cards. The barn door groans as you push it open, and suddenly you're eye to eye with him, the bull. Not just any cow, but the enormous, muscle-bound, horn-wielding monarch of the herd. His eyes glint in the dim light, and his breath huffs out in clouds that curl like smoke. If raids are dramatic, bulls are personal. And tonight you learn why Viking farmers often whispered that these horned tempers were deadlier than swords. You freeze. The bull stamps once, and the wooden planks vibrate under your boots. There's no shield wall here, no axe in your hand, just your soft body in the wrong place at the wrong time. You remind yourself not to stare too hard. Eye contact might be read as a challenge. This beast doesn't care about your saga. He's writing his own, one stomp at a time. One mainstream historical fact: bulls weren't just livestock. They were breeding capital, essential to the survival of a farm's lineage. Losing a bull meant losing your herd's future. Farmers sometimes named them, treated them with reverence, and prayed they'd remain docile. Yet the Icelandic sagas also record brutal encounters, farmers killed outright in their own barns, trampled or gored by their prize animals. Imagine the irony. You survive a raid only to be flattened by the very creature that kept you alive. As the bull snorts again, you recall a quirky tidbit. In some regions, bulls were believed to carry protective spirits, almost like living talismans. But protective for whom exactly? Certainly not the farmer lying unconscious in the straw after a poorly timed shove. Protective for the herd, perhaps, or for the gods' amusement. You can't help but think of it as a cosmic joke. Imagine calling your bull lucky while, limping around with bruised ribs, you shuffle sideways, careful as the bull shifts his weight. You think back to the sagas and realize something. Historians still argue whether these stories of violent bulls were exaggerations or simple rural fact. The sheer number of references suggests reality. After all, these are not the dainty dairy cows you see in modern postcards. These are raw, powerful animals bred to withstand harsh northern winters. The barn fills with his heavy presence. Every creak of rope, every shuffle of hooves from the tethered cows seems to echo around him. You hear the farmer muttering under his breath, almost like a chant while tossing hay into the troughs. His movements are slow, deliberate, respectful. It feels more like tending a god than feeding an animal. And yet, here comes the comedy you didn't expect. As you edge closer to the door, your foot catches on a loose board and you stumble. The bull snorts so loudly you swear the roof rattles. You're frozen, waiting for your obituary to be written in hoofprints. Instead, the bull turns away, utterly unimpressed. You laugh quietly at yourself. How raids and swords seem thrilling, but this is terror. This is the slow, steady realization that death can wear fur, chew cud, and look bored while contemplating whether to end you. Out in the fields, you hear stories of young men bragging about raiding exploits, but among the farmers, the bravado sounds different. They tell of the bull that threw a full-grown man into a hay cart, or the one that broke a fence with its head, or the time 3 brothers had to corner a bull with ropes just to shoehorn it back into the barn. Their laughter carries the same nervous edge you hear in your own chest. You glance at the bull once more, his massive shoulders rippling under coarse hide. His horns catch the light like pale blades. He's beautiful in a terrifying way, the embodiment of strength and danger in one hulking body. You realize that respecting your livestock here isn't some sentimental gesture. It's survival strategy. The bull doesn't just symbolize wealth, he is the razor's edge between survival and disaster. The air grows tense, thick with hay dust and the musk of animals. You hear the longhouse door slam shut against the wind, children giggling faintly in the distance. Life goes on, precarious and ordinary, even as death stands 10 feet away, chewing calmly. So when you hear tales of Viking bravery, remember this. Courage wasn't only measured in battle. Sometimes it was measured in the quiet, steady step of a farmer carrying hay past the horns of a bull who decided, for now, not to kill him. The sound of scythes cutting through grass fills the air, a steady metallic whisper rising and falling in rhythm with human breath. You step into the summer meadows, where neighbors bend low, swinging long-handled blades with practiced arcs. This is not the battlefield of axes and shields, it's the hayfield, but the tension in the air feels just as sharp. Here, rivalries aren't about kingdoms or crowns, they're about grass. And in Viking farming life, hay was as precious as silver. You watch the men cut, women rake, and children follow behind, gathering every blade that falls. Nothing goes to waste, because winter waits like a patient predator. Each armful carried to the drying racks is a wager placed against the cold months to come. And yet even as you breathe in the sweet scent of freshly cut grass, you hear raised voices across the meadow. Two neighbors argue over the invisible line that divides one patch from another. To you, the boundary looks arbitrary, but to them, it's the thin wall between life and starvation. One mainstream historical fact: Viking law codes often recorded hayfield disputes in detail. Land boundaries mattered so much that men swore oaths on sacred sites about where their meadows began and ended. In Iceland, some farmers even created stone markers to declare ownership of a field, as binding as any contract. And if someone crossed those markers to cut grass on another man's land, that was theft on par with stealing livestock itself. You pause to listen as the argument escalates. A farmer claims the other has cut too far over the ridge. The accused shouts back, waving his scythe not as a weapon but as punctuation. You think to yourself, only in this world could grass spark a feud that might last generations. Historians still argue whether these sagas of meadow feuds were dramatized for storytelling or recorded as grim reality, but the sheer number of hayfield disputes in Viking literature suggests truth behind the drama. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Some families went so far as to time their haymaking to the phases of the moon, believing it influenced how well the grass would dry. Imagine trying to plan your harvest around a lunar calendar, while also dodging the fury of your neighbor who swears you stole his patch of clover. Farming Science, Viking edition. You glance around at the hay racks being built, long wooden poles, crisscrossed to hold the drying grass off the damp ground. The sight is impressive, almost architectural. In this brief summer, speed matters. Rain could ruin an entire harvest if it fell before the grass dried, so farmers rushed with frantic energy. The fields become a chorus of labor, scythes swishing, rakes scraping, children laughing nervously as adults shout instructions. But beneath the rhythm hums rivalry. You overhear whispers about one family hoarding more than their fair share, or another sneaking out at dawn to cut grass before others arrived. These aren't petty rumors, they're survival accusations. A family with a smaller haystack faces a brutal winter, while their better supplied neighbor might make it through. With animals intact, resentment festers in the long dark months when bellies growl. And here comes the humor, because even in the tightrope act of survival, human pettiness shines. You hear a farmer grumble that his neighbor's cows must be eating grass painted, Green because they're too fat to be real. You almost laugh out loud imagining medieval farmers inventing sarcastic memes in the form of pasture gossip. Still, as the sun lowers, the work doesn't stop. Torches flare to keep the rhythm going. You taste the sweat on your lips, mixed with the sharp sweetness of cut hay. Every armful stacked on the rack feels like a coin in the bank, but coins can be stolen, and hayfields can be fought over, and you understand now why sagas spoke of brothers turned enemies. The field may look peaceful, but every blade cut is a reminder. Someone always thinks you've taken too much. The fjord gleams beyond the meadow, calm and blue, as if mocking the human chaos on shore. Raiders might cross those waters in sleek longships, dreaming of treasure, but here on land, the true drama unfolds in plain sight, where survival depends not on axes but on who claims the richest grass. As you step away from the meadow, the sound of bickering lingers behind you, carried on the wind. You realize that, in Viking life, a raid might last a day, but a hayfield feud could last lifetimes. And in its own quiet way, that's scarier. You duck into the longhouse again as evening closes in, the smoke rolling low and thick across the rafters. The first thing you notice isn't the warmth of the fire. It's the cows, tethered along the inside wall, shifting and snorting in the dimness. Their hulking bodies steam faintly in the lantern glow, and the smell hits you like a wall. Dung, sweat, and hay braided together into one heavy perfume. You're not just sharing a roof with your family here, you're sharing it with your herd, night after night, all winter long. It's a strange arrangement, but practical. The cow's body heat keeps the room warmer, and in the biting cold of a Nordic winter, that warmth could mean survival. One mainstream historical fact. In Viking-era Scandinavia and Iceland, it was common for longhouses to be divided lengthwise, with humans living on one side and animals stabled on the other. Archaeological digs at places like Stong in Iceland reveal hearths positioned so smoke drifted over both humans and livestock, a crude but effective way to disinfect and keep disease down. Of course, the cozy image of snuggling up with cows comes at a cost. The smoke makes your eyes sting, and the air is so thick you cough even while sitting still. Every cough echoes with the reminder, lungs weren't built for this. And while your ancestors might have bragged about rugged Viking lungs, historians still argue whether chronic respiratory issues from smoke contributed to the low average life expectancy of the era. You think, not without sarcasm, that Viking healthcare probably consisted of someone saying, "Hey, walk it off." You watch a child toddle between the animals, patting a cow's flank with sticky fingers. The cow flicks its tail and almost knocks. The kid flat. The mother just sighs and keeps stirring the stew, clearly accustomed to the constant dance of danger inside her own home. And here's your quirky tidbit. Manure wasn't just an unpleasant byproduct. Farmers sometimes dried it and used it as fuel for fires. So the same stuff you curse when you step in it, it might be what keeps your stew boiling later that night. Nothing wasted, not even dung. You shift uneasily on the bench, aware of the ever-present risk. One startled cow could kick, crush, or gore a person in this confined space. And yet, here, you all are pretending it's normal, because the alternative is freezing outside. The animals huff and sigh, their warm breath mingling with the smoke. Your cloak smells permanently of barn, no matter how many times you air it out. The atmosphere is both intimate and oppressive. The fire crackles, casting shadows that dance across horns and rafters alike. The cows chew methodically, their jaws grinding like a background drumbeat. It's almost hypnotic, until one suddenly moos loudly and startles you out of your daze. Everyone else barely reacts, too used to the sudden noise. You realize then that raiders may come from beyond the fjord, but the chaos inside the longhouse is its own constant battle. And of course, there's the humor in it. You imagine trying to explain this setup to someone in the future. Yes, I live with my spouse, children, and 12 cows. No, it's not crowded at all. Yes, it does smell. No, the cows don't pay rent. You chuckle softly, and one of the cows stares at you as though insulted by the joke. But beneath the laughter lies unease. Parasites, fleas, lice, and disease thrive in this close proximity. You scratch at your collar, suddenly itchy, and wonder how anyone got a full night's sleep. Historians still argue whether the decision to stable animals indoors was born of true necessity, or if it also served a symbolic role, binding family and herd as one community. Either way, the cows feel less like guests and more like permanent roommates with questionable hygiene. Night deepens, and the longhouse hums with mingled sounds, the crackle of firewood, the creak of beams under snow load, the sighs of people dozing, the steady shuffle of hooves. You close your eyes and realize you're breathing the same thick air as everyone else, family and herd alike. And whether you like it or not, survival here depends on learning to live with the cows as housemates, neighbors, and uninvited bedfellows. The morning fog clings to the ground, curling in pale fingers around the posts of the cowshed. You pull your cloak tighter and step inside, greeted immediately by a swarm of buzzing flies that seem to rise straight out of the dung-slick floor. The cows shuffle nervously, swishing their tails, but the real enemies here are invisible. Parasites, plagues and creeping sicknesses. These are the foes Viking farmers feared in silence, because you couldn't fight them with axe or shield. You watch a calf cough, its thin ribs fluttering with the effort, and a chill slides down your spine. There's no veterinarian, no miracle cure. Just trial, error, and prayers muttered under the smoke-black rafters. One mainstream historical fact: outbreaks of cattle disease in medieval Europe could wipe out entire herds. While not every detail is recorded in Viking sources, scholars know that rinderpest and other bovine plagues devastated herds for centuries. Some argue that similar outbreaks stalked the Norse world, silently deciding who thrived and who starved. Historians still argue whether specific sagas hint at real epidemics among livestock, or if those stories are metaphorical, but the fear was real either way. You crouch near a trough and notice worms writhing in the damp hay. Parasites flourished in these close, smoky barns. Fleas carried from cow to human, lice clinging to cloaks, worms burrowed in bellies. You scratch absently at your collar, though you know it's just your imagination. Or maybe not. Even the cows flick their ears constantly, fighting off invisible gnats that seem to own the place. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some Viking farmers hung pungent herbs like juniper or angelica in the cowsheds, believing the smoke or scent would ward off sickness. Imagine fumigating your barn with clouds of herbal incense while your cows blink through the haze looking unimpressed. Half medicine, half superstition, all desperation. You lean back against a beam, breathing shallowly, to avoid the worst of the smell. The cows shift, their hides glistening with sweat despite the chill. A farmer approaches one sickly animal, mutters a charm under his breath and dabs its nose with some kind of ointment. Whether it's healing or just ritual comfort, you can't say, but you can feel the weight of the moment. If this cow dies, the family's chances for winter shrink with it. Outside you hear distant voices, neighbors gossiping about whose cows look weak, whose herd might spread disease. Fear makes people cruel. A rumor of sickness could isolate a family, cut them off from trade, brand them unlucky. You realize quickly that disease wasn't just a biological threat, it was social poison too. And yet, there's humor here as well, even in the gloom. A boy rushes past, swatting at flies with a bundle of straw, cursing loudly in words far too sharp for his age. His mother scolds him, but you grin, because no saga poet ever wrote about the epic battle against barnflies. If they had, maybe those tales would have sounded more familiar than the raids. The air grows heavier the longer you linger. You can almost taste the sickness, though it's just the sour blend of manure and damp hay. Still, you understand why. Viking farmers feared their barns more than foreign raiders. Raiders might burn your house once, but parasites? They wage war every single day, from dawn until dusk, invisible and merciless. You glance back at the coughing calf, its eyes wide and watery, and your chest tightens. This isn't a heroic saga. It's a slow, grinding battle with enemies too, small to see, fought in the shadows of cowsheds. And yet, it is no less terrifying. So as you step back out into the open air, gulping in the salty breath of the fjord, you realize that sometimes the scariest dangers aren't the ones charging at you with swords. They're the ones that creep, crawl, and fester in the quiet places, turning life into a gamble you never agreed to play. The night sky drapes itself over the fjord like a dark wool cloak, and the longhouse glows faintly with firelight. You step inside, expecting the usual sounds of cows shifting. But tonight, there's a different rhythm. The low murmur of chants, the flicker of flames dancing higher, the smell of burning fat mingling with smoke. The family has gathered in ritual, and the cows tethered nearby loom like sacred witnesses. This isn't just dinner or chores, it's sacrifice. You watch as the farmer places a carved wooden bowl before the hearth, filled not with food for humans but with offerings to the gods, milk, butter, and on rarer, heavier nights like this, blood. The air grows thick with expectation. One mainstream historical fact: Norse sources describe blot, sacrificial rites where animals, often cattle, were slaughtered to honor gods and spirits. Their blood was sprinkled on altars, walls, even the people themselves, binding farm and faith in one act. The cow in question stands tethered near the fire, its eyes reflecting the flames. It shifts, uneasy, as the farmer's knife gleams. For a moment you hold your breath, because you know this isn't just a loss of livestock. This is wealth being given up willingly, a desperate bargain for health, fertility, or mercy through the winter. The children's eyes are wide, both terrified and reverent. You realize sacrifice was as much about fear as it was about devotion. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Not all offerings involved slaughter. Sometimes farmers poured fresh milk into the earth, letting it soak into the soil as a gift to unseen land spirits. Imagine crouching with a clay jug, solemnly pouring out your breakfast. For elves you hope are real. If nothing else, the mice certainly appreciated it. The ritual begins in earnest. The farmer murmurs prayers to Freya, god of fertility, while the family joins in soft whispers. The cow is killed swiftly, blood gathered into a bowl and flicked. Across the beams with a brush of twigs, drops spatter across faces, horns, even the fire itself. It's messy, solemn, and strangely ordinary. You can't help but think of the paradox. Cows, both sustenance and sacrifice, were the axis around which every hope turned. Historians still argue whether these rites were communal festivals or smaller family practices, but the archaeological finds, bones buried near farmsteads, residues of blood in ritual bowls, hint that both existed side by side. What's certain is that cattle weren't just beasts of burden, They were seen as bridges to the divine. The cows tethered along the wall watch silently, their heavy breaths filling the smoky air. Do they understand? Probably not, but their presence makes the room feel fuller, heavier. You can almost sense the farmer pleading not just with the gods, but with the herd itself. Stay with us. Give us milk. Keep us alive. You sit quietly, feeling the tension ease as the ritual ends. Meat from the sacrifice will be shared. Hides turned into tools, nothing wasted. The family eats solemnly, but relief flickers in their faces, an unspoken belief that the gods have been fed, and therefore perhaps the farm will be spared. And then humor sneaks in, because one of the younger children, face smeared with blood, Flex leans over and whispers, "Does this mean we can ask for better weather too?" His mother shushes him, but you stifle a chuckle. Even amid sacred rites, human impatience and practicality shine through. The fire crackles lower, smoke curling toward the rafters. The cows settle back into their rhythm, chewing, sighing, lowing softly in the dark. And you realize, sacrifice here isn't spectacle, it's survival theater. A way of saying, we see the danger, we know our place, and we're willing to pay the price. As you step outside into the cold night, the fjord lies silent and vast, stars scattered like silver across its black waters. The echo of chants lingers in your ears, and you feel the weight of the ritual press on you. This wasn't about glory, wasn't about war. It was about fear softened by faith, a desperate hope that the cows you live beside won't be the cows you bury before spring. The morning mist lingers low over the fields as you trudge along the path, listening to the steady clop of hooves ahead. Day farmer leads 2 cows, each tethered with rough rope, their heavy bodies swaying side to side as though they carry the weight of entire futures. And in truth, they do. Here in Viking life, cattle aren't just animals, they're politics, dowries, marriages, and the subtle chess game of survival. One mainstream historical fact: in early medieval Scandinavia, cows were often part of marriage negotiations. A bride's family might give cows as dowry, or the groom's family might gift livestock to prove wealth. Wealth wasn't measured in coins as often as in healthy heifers. To marry well, you needed a herd to your name. A Viking poet might boast of silver arm rings, but the family in the next longhouse knows exactly how many cows he owns. And that tells the truer story. You glance at the 2 cows swaying along the path and imagine them as part of such a deal. One young woman's chance at a stable future, one young man's ability to claim respect in the community, bound up in the temper of a single animal. And here's the quirky tidbit. Sagas sometimes recorded disputes where brides were returned, like defective goods, if the cows promised as dowry turned out to be sickly or barren. Imagine the awkwardness of returning both bride and cow with a polite, "Sorry, neither was quite up to scratch." The longhouse looms ahead, its smoke curling lazily into the sky. Inside, families sit cross-legged while negotiations unfold. Cows are counted, their age and fertility debated as intensely as any treaty between kings. You hear voices rising and falling. 2 heifers, 3 calves, no, 1 is lame, but we demand another. The cattle stand outside, chewing cud, entirely unaware that they are the stars of this drama. Historians still argue whether these negotiations gave women true leverage or reduced them to pawns in a bovine economy. On the one hand, a strong dowry of cows could elevate a woman's social value. On the other hand, the very fact her worth was tied to livestock unsettles modern readers. But in that smoky longhouse, the families don't think of it as degrading. They think of it as survival math. The scene softens as you picture a wedding feast, Cows tethered outside, their hides gleaming in torchlight. Guests laugh and drink, but beneath the merriment lies the knowledge that without those animals, there'd be no marriage, no household, no shared hope for children to feed. You realize then that cows aren't just wealth. They're the scaffolding of society itself. And yet there's comedy here too if you squint at it. Imagine bragging at a wedding. Yes, my daughter married well. He came with 3 cows and a particularly handsome bull. Or worse, imagine the unlucky suitor arriving with only a goat. The whispers would ripple through the feast like wildfire. The politics don't end with weddings. They ripple outward into alliances, feuds, and even the weight of law. A man with many cows has power. A man with none is vulnerable. A single stolen cow could spark years of bitterness. You think back to the meadow rivalries and see how seamlessly the drama folds into family life. It's all connected: hay, marriage, cows, and the quiet grinding game of survival. The farmer ties the cows near the longhouse and steps inside to continue his haggling. You linger, watching the animals chew calmly, tails flicking at flies. They look ordinary, almost boring. And yet, in them lies the power to build or break lives, to join families or start blood feuds. As the mist lifts, the fjord glimmers in, pale light. Across the water, longships rest, their dragon heads yawning toward the horizon. You realize how skewed the image of Viking life is. Raiding ships get carved into sagas, but cows, standing quietly in the mist, shaped destinies far, more often. The wind carries the smell of salt and tar as you step down toward the fjord. Longships rock gently at their moorings, their carved dragon prows glaring out across the water. You expect to see warriors boarding, iron helms gleaming, but today the ships aren't loaded with men and weapons. They're loaded with barrels, butter, hides, tallow, even horn and bone, all products of the cow. You smile quietly at the irony. Viking ships might be remembered for carrying plunder, but in truth they often carried dairy. One mainstream historical fact: archaeological evidence and medieval records show that butter, cheese, and hides were staple goods in Viking trade. These were shipped not only between Scandinavian settlements, but across the North Sea to markets in Britain and beyond. Butter, packed in wooden barrels, kept longer than fresh milk and became one of the most valuable exports. Wealth wasn't just raided, it was churned. The dock creaks beneath your boots as you watch men roll barrels into place. The cowsheds up the valley suddenly seem connected to the farthest coasts of Europe. Every slice of cheese, every scraped hide, could sail as far as Dublin, York, or even beyond. You lean against a post and imagine the surprise of an English merchant expecting silver, but receiving butter instead. You chuckle softly. Nothing says terrifying Viking like dropping off a cargo of dairy products. And here's a quirky tidbit. Butter wasn't just food. In some households it was rubbed into hair as a conditioner or smeared on skin to soften it. Imagine showing up at market, slick with butter, gleaming like a well-oiled statue, and trying to haggle with a straight face. Suddenly raiders don't sound as intimidating when you picture them shining like dairy candles. The longship's hull creaks as another hide bundle is tossed aboard. The hides, stiff and stinking, are destined to become shoes, belts, and armor across distant markets. You realize that the cow economy stretched far beyond the farm fence. A single herd in a remote fjord valley could ripple outward, connecting to foreign traders, distant towns, and entire economies. Historians still argue whether Viking raids and Viking trade were separate endeavors or two sides of the same coin. Did raiders pillage one season, and then turn merchants the next, hauling butter and hides to the very towns they once attacked? The debate continues, but the evidence suggests that many longships carried both axes and barrels, depending on which offered more profit. The scene shifts as the crew prepares to leave. The sails unfurl, catching the brisk wind, and the dragon prows lurch forward. You hear the rhythmic slap of oars dipping into water, the creak of timbers, the low chant of men settling into the long row ahead. But instead of silver and captives, this voyage carries butter stacked in barrels, swaying gently in the hold. You can't help but laugh at the contrast. Imagine being an Irish villager, spotting a dragon ship on the horizon, heart pounding in fear, only to find out the terrifying, "Invaders are here to sell cheese." Fear turns quickly to awkward bargaining. "Yes, I'll take 2 barrels, but no raiding this time, please." As the ship slips away into the grey horizon, you're left standing on the dock with the smell of salt and dairy clinging to the air. You glance back up the slope, where cows chew in their sheds, utterly oblivious to the fact that their milk will soon be sloshing in mugs hundreds of miles away. And in that moment, it hits you. Viking power wasn't only forged in raids. It was spread in trade, and cows were silent captains of that empire. Longships might roar with dragon heads, but their bellies rumbled with butter. The night settles heavy across the valley, stars pricking through the velvet dark, and the longhouse flickers with firelight. You lie back on a rough bench, listening as voices rise around the hearth. Tonight no one talks of hayfields or milk turning sour. Tonight the sagas take hold. And in these sagas, cows are not just beasts. They are mythic, colossal, sometimes cosmic. You blink drowsily as the storyteller leans forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, weaving cows into destiny. One mainstream historical fact. In Norse mythology, the very first being to appear from the melting ice was a cow, Audhumla. Her milk fed the giant Ymir, the ancestor of all frost giants. With her tongue she licked the salty ice, freeing Buri, the first god. Without this primeval cow, the whole saga of the gods might never have begun. You realize with a shiver that the people gathered here don't just see cows as property, they see them as sacred origins. The fire crackles, shadows leap across the walls, and the children lean closer as the storyteller speaks of Audumla's teats flowing rivers of milk. It sounds half absurd, half divine. You chuckle softly at the image, yet you sense the reverence in the room. Milk wasn't just food, it was life itself, cosmic and eternal. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some later folk tales describe magical cows that never ran dry, producing endless milk for their owners. Imagine the envy such a cow would spark. You think of modern fables about golden geese and laugh. Apparently, ancient farmers had their own dairy-themed version. Who needs infinite gold when you could have infinite cream for your porridge? The saga shifts. The voice rises, painting pictures of cows stolen by giants, cows that roared like thunder, cows whose hides became the skies. You hear gasps, laughter, the shuffle of feet as neighbors soak in the imagery, and even though you know its story, you feel the weight of belief pressing in. Historians still argue whether these tales were meant as literal faith, moral lessons, or simple entertainment. But in this smoky room, it doesn't matter. The line between history and myth blurs like breath in winter air. The cows tethered along the longhouse wall snort and shift as though responding. Their shadows stretch tall and monstrous, horns seeming to scrape the rafters. For a moment you see them as the listeners do, not as livestock, but as echoes of divine creatures. Each chew of cud becomes a reminder that without cows, the gods, themselves might never have risen. You grin as the storyteller pauses for effect, leaning into the silence. Then, with a mischievous smile, he recounts a tale of a trickster who disguised himself as a cow to sneak into a feast. The room bursts into laughter, even the dour grandmother snorting at the absurdity. You imagine some poor man lowing and pawing the ground badly enough to fool no one. But beneath the laughter lies awe. You realize that sagas about raiders and heroes come and go, but sagas about cows linger because they strike closer to daily life. People here spend more time with cows than with kings. Myth simply amplifies what everyone already knows. Cows are fate. The fire burns lower. The storyteller's voice softening. He speaks of omens. Cows that refuse to give milk foretelling disaster. Cows lowing in the night warning of raids. You feel the tension tighten again, the room hushed. For these farmers, myth isn't separate from reality. It's a way of making sense of the dangers they live with daily. As the embers crackle, you glance at the cows once more. Their hulking shapes blend with shadow, their eyes glimmer faintly. They're ordinary beasts chewing hay. And yet, in the sagas, they are pillars of creation, tricksters, prophets, divine messengers. You smile sleepily at the thought. Perhaps the cows knew all along they were the stars of this saga. You're just finally catching up. The morning fog hangs low over the fjord, muffling sound as you trudge along the muddy track. Somewhere beyond the ridge, you hear faint shouts, maybe fishermen preparing their boats, maybe a family calling cattle back from pasture. For a moment, you imagine what it must feel like to stand on the prow of a longship, wind in your hair, axe at your side. But then your boot sinks ankle-deep into manure, and the fantasy dies quickly. This is the heart of Viking life, not raids and plunder, but chores. And in the quiet hours, you weigh the dream of plunder against the reality of muck. You shoulder a pitchfork and follow the farmer into the cowshed. The air is heavy, sour with hay and dung, but it's familiar now, almost comforting. You stab into the hay, toss it toward the troughs, and listen to the steady sound of chewing. Every bite the cows take is a reminder. Raids might bring silver, but cows keep you alive. One mainstream historical fact: most Viking-age men were not full-time raiders but part-time farmers. Even those who joined expeditions returned to tend fields and livestock. Raiding was a seasonal job, glamorous in story but risky in practice. Farming was the daily grind, often more feared and more necessary. Still, temptation lingers. You hear two young men joking outside, comparing themselves to raiders who've sailed west. They laugh about feasts in foreign halls, about gold armbands heavy on their wrists. Their voices grow softer, though, when the farmer's wife scolds them to fetch water. You grin. Dreams of silver fade quickly when faced with another trip to the icy stream. Historians still argue whether the majority of Viking raids were driven by restless young men seeking fame or by sheer necessity when farms failed. Looking at the mud on your boots and the hay dust in your nose, you suspect hunger was often the louder motivator. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some sagas mock men who boasted of raids but were secretly terrified of farm chores. Imagine being remembered not as a warrior, but as the one who feared the milking stool. A humiliating epitaph, but perhaps a common truth. You step outside to dump a bucket of muck, and the fjord stretches wide and grey before you. A longship sits idle, its hull slick with dew. For a moment you let yourself dream, rowing into foreign harbours, the thrill of combat, the rush of looting silver chalices. But then you glance back at the barn. The cows low impatiently, demanding attention. They don't care about your dreams, they care about fodder. And without them, you'll starve long before you set foot on foreign shores. The rhythm of chores pulls you back in. Milk to churn, stalls to clean, hides to scrape. You realize that this constant cycle leaves little room for adventure. Raiding is dramatic, yes, but it's also optional. Cows are not. They tether you to the land, demanding devotion more consuming than any chieftain's call. Humor sneaks in as you imagine a raider returning home, silver jingling in his pouch, only to be handed a pitchfork by his wife. Great, you're back. Now muck the stalls. You chuckle because you can almost see the defeated slump of his shoulders. The day stretches on, chores piling one after another. You feel the weight of the comparison pressing in. Raids last weeks, maybe months. But cows, they demand every day of your life. You think of sagas praising glory in foreign lands, and you wonder how many unspoken sagas took place right here, in barns and fields, where survival mattered more than fame. As the sun dips low, painting the fjord in silver streaks, you lean on your pitchfork and sigh. You've dreamed of raids, yes, but you've lived the chores, and now you understand. The cows were always more terrifying because they were inescapable. Glory could wait. The manure never did. The cold sharpens. As the days shorten, the air tasting like iron and snow, you step outside at dawn and see the pastures stretched under a sheet of frost, blades of grass brittle as glass. The cows stand at the fence line, their breaths rising in pale clouds, lowing impatiently. But there is nothing left for them to eat out here. Frozen pastures turn the valley into a white desert, and desperation creeps in as quietly as the frost itself. You trudge back to the barn, shoulders hunched against the wind. The hayloft still holds bundles, but already the stack looks smaller, the edges ragged where handfuls have been torn away day after day. You climb the ladder, pull down a bale, and feel its weight. Lighter than you'd like, not nearly enough. For the mouths that wait below, you swallow hard. Winter is only beginning. One mainstream historical fact. In Viking Age Scandinavia, the short growing season made fodder management a matter of life and death. Winters could last 6 months, or, more meaning every blade of summer grass had to be carefully dried, stored and rationed. Even then, many herds were slaughtered in autumn, because farmers knew they wouldn't have enough feed to keep them all alive until spring. You feel the weight of that decision as you watch the cows munch on hay, their eyes expectant, their bellies never quite full. To slaughter some early means losing milk, losing future calves, losing wealth, but to keep too many alive risks starvation for all. Historians still argue whether mass culls were strategic or simply acts of desperation. Either way, the choice must have been agonizing. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some sagas hint that farmers fed seaweed to cows in lean winters. You imagine trudging to the icy shore, hauling dripping bundles of kelp and tossing them into the trough. The cows chew reluctantly, their jaws working with exaggerated slowness, clearly unimpressed. You grin despite yourself. Nothing like cows rolling their eyes at your desperate ingenuity. Inside the longhouse, the mood shifts with the weather. Conversations grow quieter, meals smaller, jokes edged with tension. A single sneeze from a cow makes everyone glance up nervously, because illness in midwinter is more than inconvenient, it's catastrophic. Children press their hands against the animal's warm flanks, drawing comfort from their heat, even as the family frets over dwindling supplies. The days blur together. Each morning begins with the same dread. how much hay is left. You can almost hear the barn creaking with worry, the bales shrinking like sand slipping through fingers. At night, you lie awake listening to the cows shuffle, their hooves thumping, their breaths heavy. The rhythm should be soothing, but instead it gnaws at you like hunger itself. Out in the fields, snow piles high against the fences. You picture the cows wandering out there, searching for grass buried under ice, finding nothing but silence. The thought unsettles you. The world that fed them has vanished, sealed away until spring, leaving only human calculation between survival and loss. And here comes the humor, faint but necessary. You imagine telling a would-be raider about your daily battles. You crossed the North Sea to fight Saxons? That's nice. I just negotiated with a cow about whether seaweed counts as dinner. You chuckle softly, the absurdity of it lifting the weight for a moment, but the humor fades quickly as you step outside and stare across the frozen landscape. The fjord lies still, locked in icy silence. The hills loom, white and unforgiving. You realize that winter here isn't just a season, it's an enemy, and unlike raiders, it cannot be fought with steel. It only waits, gnawing at fodder piles, stretching hunger into months. By evening the cows are restless again, hooves scraping against the floor, eyes glinting in firelight. You feed them another ration, smaller than yesterday, and whisper a silent plea, "Last until spring, last until spring." The snow lies deep across the valley, muffling every sound until even your boots crunching feel too loud. Inside the longhouse, the fire crackles, casting a glow over the tethered cows. You're weary from hauling hay and scraping muck, but tonight, the air feels different. A soft chant drifts through the room, low and melodic, weaving around the smoke. The dairymaids are singing to the herd, their voices rise and fall like waves, syllables drawn out, each line more lullaby than prayer. You lean back against a post and close your eyes. The cows sway slightly, ears twitching as if they understand. One mainstream historical fact: Scandinavian traditions of kulning, high-pitched herding calls, date back centuries. Women's voices carried across valleys, guiding cattle from pastures. While most people imagine Viking war cries, it was these eerie, beautiful cow songs that echoed daily through the mountains. Here in the winter dark, the tones shift from command to comfort. Instead of summoning cows home, the songs soothe them through long nights. You realize this is not just work, it's ritual. Historians still argue whether these chants were purely practical or had magical undertones, meant to protect the herd from disease and predators. Listening now, you'd believe either. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some songs were said to charm cows into giving more milk. Imagine standing by a pail, singing your heart out, hoping your voice would turn into cream and butter. You grin at the absurdity, but you also sense the quiet desperation behind it. When milk meant survival, a good voice was worth as much as a strong arm. The longhouse grows hushed except for the singing. Even the children stop squirming, lulled by the rhythm. The cows chew slowly, tails flicking less, their restless shuffles quieting as though the song smooths their nerves. The air feels enchanted, the smoke swirling in patterns you're not sure are entirely random. One maid's voice rises higher, so sharp it pierces through the rafters, and you picture summer meadows again, cows answering the call, bells jangling. As they meander home, the memory feels alive, carried on the notes even as snow piles against the door. You realize the songs are more than music. They're bridges to seasons past, reminders of green fields waiting beneath the ice. Then humor sneaks in, as it always does. A boy sitting near the fire tries to mimic the high-pitched calls, his voice cracking halfway through. The room erupts in muffled laughter, the cows snorting as though joining in. For a moment, the tension of winter lightens, laughter and song mingling in a way that makes the barn feel almost festive. The singing continues, softer now, rolling like a heartbeat. You watch the cows blink slowly, eyelids drooping, their breathing steady. It's a lullaby not just for them, but for you as well. The fear of dwindling hay, the cold pressing in, the parasites and plagues, all fade beneath the spell of song. And yet, you sense the deeper truth. These cow songs aren't mere background music. They're tools of survival, emotional armor against despair. They remind you that work can be woven with beauty, that fear can be softened with melody. You smile, drowsy, as the chants settle into your bones. By the time the fire burns low, the cows are still, the children asleep, and the women's voices have faded to a hum. You let your head rest against the post, half dreaming, half awake, lulled by the afterglow of song. And you think, if raiders heard this, even they might pause, struck by the strange power of a farmer's lullaby. The cold clings to the longhouse like a second skin, the smoke settling low as you stir from uneasy sleep. Outside, the snow creaks, under the hooves of restless cows, their lowing carrying through the timbers. But the sound that gnaws at you tonight isn't hunger or frost. It's the cough of a sick animal. A wet, rasping cough that echoes through the barn, reminding you that disease is never far away. One mainstream historical fact: throughout medieval Europe, outbreaks of bovine plagues, like rinderpest, could devastate entire regions, while the evidence for specific diseases in the Viking North is fragmentary. Some scholars believe descriptions of sudden herd losses in the sagas hint at epidemics sweeping through the cowsheds. Historians still argue whether these were genuine rinderpest outbreaks or simply starvation misremembered as plague, but the fear rings true either way. You move closer to the sick cow, its eyes watery, its sides heaving. The family watches silently. No healer is coming, no miracle cure exists. At best, you can separate the animal, pray it survives, and prepare for the worst if it doesn't. The farmer mutters about evil spirits riding the night wind while his wife sprinkles herbs on the floor. You wonder, are you fighting germs, or ghosts, or both? Here's your quirky tidbit. In some traditions, farmers smeared tar along a cow's back as a folk remedy, believing the stench would drive off sickness. You picture a herd of cows coated in sticky black stripes, looking more like battle-ready warriors than dairy animals. You can't help but smile, though the laughter feels thin against the fear in the room. The smell of sickness seeps into the air, sour and unsettling. The cows shift uneasily as though they too sense the danger. Each one is both an anchor of survival and a ticking risk. You realize that disease doesn't just strike bodies, it fractures entire households. Neighbors whisper about who has healthy herds, who hides sick animals, who might spread ruin with every hoofprint. You lean against a beam, listening to the coughing fade into silence, unsure if that's better or worse. The farmer glances toward. The door worry etched deep in his face. If the herd fails, there will be no butter to sell, no hides to trade, no calves for the future. Raiding ships might bring silver, but silver cannot replace milk. The fire hisses in the hearth, casting shadows that seem to twitch like fevered shapes. You imagine how helpless it must have felt, watching a plague creep from cow to cow. No walls could keep it out, no axe could kill it. Fear would spread faster than the sickness itself, haunting every creak of the barn. And yet humor lingers even here. One boy, trying to lighten the mood, mutters that maybe the gods are just tired of sour milk. His mother cuffs him lightly, but a few chuckles break the tension. You smile. Humor has always been the medicine for what can't be healed. The night stretches long, filled with uneasy sleep and muffled prayers. You dream of invisible armies crawling through the barns, striking silently at the herds. And when you wake, the cough echoes again, a reminder that the real terror in Viking life often wasn't foreign raiders storming the shore. It was the slow creeping shadow of disease lodged in the lungs of a cow tethered just beyond your bed. The pale light of dawn filters through the longhouse smoke, catching on the churn and the pails stacked in a crooked line. You hear the cows lowing impatiently, their udders heavy with milk. And it's not the farmer who hurries forward, it's the women. Cloaked against the cold, hair tucked under kerchiefs, they move with the rhythm of generations, hands practiced, backs already aching. In this Viking world, women carry the double weight of power and peril through their dairy work. 1. Mainstream historical fact. Norse law codes and sagas often describe women as the primary managers of dairy. They milked, churned, and processed everything from butter to cheese, and these products weren't just food. They were currency, trade goods, even ritual offerings. A household standing often rested on the skill of its women to transform fragile milk into something lasting. You sit on a low stool watching as one dairymaid presses her head against a cow's flank, fingers working quickly. The sound of streams hitting the pail is steady, hypnotic. But the job isn't as gentle as it looks. A kick from a restless leg, a tail swiping manure into the bucket. Every day is a test of patience. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some Icelandic sources describe charms whispered during milking, half prayer, half command, meant to keep the cow calm and the milk flowing. You grin at the thought of women singing stern lullabies to stubborn udders. The churn thumps in the corner, butter slowly, forming under the rhythm of an arm that never seems to tire. The women hum softly, sometimes songs of comfort, sometimes chants that feel like spells. You realize their power lies not just in muscle, but in knowledge. When to skim, when to stir, when the smell means danger. Without them, the cow's gift would spoil before anyone could eat, yet the work carries peril too. You watch one woman stumble as a cow jerks suddenly, nearly catching her with its horn. She steadies herself quickly, muttering a curse under her breath, but your heart pounds. The dangers of bulls you've already seen, but even docile milk cows could maim in an instant. Historians still argue whether women's central role in dairy gave them unusual authority in Viking households. On one hand, sagas describe women controlling food stores and trading dairy at markets, wielding influence through butter and cheese. On the other, they were bound by expectation, their labor invisible to the glory of raids and feasts. You can't decide which truth feels heavier as you watch them work, power or burden. The air fills with the rich smell of fresh butter. Children hover nearby, waiting for scraps, while men glance over but don't interfere. You sense the silent acknowledgement. This domain belongs to the women. The churn, the pails, the fragile line between nourishment and hunger, all theirs. And yet, even here, humor finds its way. One girl flicks a splash of milk at her sister, who squeals and chases her through the smoky room, nearly knocking over the butter tub. The women laugh, shaking their heads, while the cows blink slowly, chewing as though above such nonsense. The day stretches, the rhythm steady. Milk, churn, sing, scold, repeat. Your arms ache just from watching, but the women never falter. There, work binds the farm together, a quiet empire of dairy that no saga poet bothered to immortalize. You think with a sleepy smile that if the sagas had been written by dairymaids, Viking history would look very different. Less about blood on battlefields, more about cream rising in the churn. As evening falls, the butter is salted, the milk cooled in clay jars, the women finally stretching their backs with weary sighs. You realize that while raiders might boast of plunder, the true daily victories belong to these women, their hands red from cold, their arms strong from labor. Power and peril, carried in the quiet work of keeping milk from turning sour. The wind rattles the shutters, but inside the longhouse it isn't the storm outside that dominates the conversation. It's a dispute. Two men sit across the fire, from each other voices rising, eyes sharp. The issue isn't silverland or weapons, it's hoofprints. A cow wandered into the wrong meadow, trampled grass, maybe nibbled too much, and now justice itself must be measured in cattle terms. 1. Mainstream historical fact. Viking law codes like the sagas in Iceland are filled with references to livestock. Fines for stolen or injured cows were carefully calculated, often in exact amounts of silver or in replacement animals. If a man's bull gored someone, the owner could be held responsible. In this world, the law walked on 4 legs. You lean forward, listening as the argument grows heated. One farmer insists his neighbor's cow destroyed part of his haystack. The other swears it was a stray from farther down the valley. Witnesses are called, not to battles but to confirm whose cow left the offending prints. You stifle a smile at the seriousness of it, yet you also sense the tension. Livelihoods hang on the outcome. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some sagas, cows are given as compensation for manslaughter. Yes, you heard right. Sometimes human lives were literally valued in cattle. Imagine attending a court and watching someone say, 2 heifers for your brother's life. You almost laugh, but the humor has sharp edges, because to these farmers, wealth and survival were tied so tightly to cows that even blood could be balanced with butter. The fire crackles as the assembly debates. The law speaker, a man chosen to recite legal precedents from memory, rises to chant the rules. His words sound solemn, almost ritualistic, as he lays out the fine structure. How many cows equal how much damage? How many must be paid if theft is proven? The farmers nod reluctantly, though the grumbling doesn't fade. You realize the law isn't just about justice, it's about keeping feuds from boiling into bloodshed. Historians still argue whether these cow-centered laws were effective at maintaining peace or merely temporary bandages over deeper rivalries. But sitting here, you see the strategy. Better to settle with livestock than with swords. Still, judging by the farmers' glares, swords aren't entirely off the table. The cows themselves, tethered nearby, chew lazily, oblivious to the legal drama they inspire. One flicks its tail, smacking a child in the face, earning a round of laughter that briefly diffuses the tension. Humor always slips in, even at trials. You grin, imagining the gods chuckling at mortals locked in furious debate while the supposed culprits chew cud in blissful ignorance. As the ruling is handed down, compensation agreed and fines promised, you notice the subtle relief on both men's faces. They may grumble, but neither wants to risk a feud in the dead of winter. Cows once again have dictated the terms of peace. You step outside into the cold night, stars glimmering faintly over the fjord. The wind howls, but inside the longhouse the law has spoken, and for now the valley holds together. You shake your head, marveling. Raiders fought for honor, Kings fought for land, but here, justice itself wears hooves and leaves muddy prints on the grass. The longhouse is quiet tonight, save for the steady creak of timbers and the rhythmic sigh of cows shifting in their stalls. You sit near the fire, feeling its warmth ebb and flow, and realize how many lives here don't end in raids or battlefields, but right under these smoky beams. For all the sagas filled with swords and glory, countless Viking deaths were humbler, slower, and sometimes lonelier. Inside barns. You glance at the elder lying on a straw bed by the hearth. His breaths are shallow, his skin pale beneath the flickering firelight. The family sits nearby keeping vigil, but there's no healer coming, no priest with final rites. The cows are the only other witnesses, their great bodies looming, breath steaming in the cold. In this world, to die in the barn isn't shameful, it's ordinary. One mainstream historical fact, archaeological evidence from farmsteads across Iceland and Norway suggests that many people lived and died in the same longhouses that held their animals. Graves often show signs of lives shaped by chronic labor, disease and malnutrition, rather than battle wounds. Historians still argue whether the Viking stereotype of warrior deaths is exaggerated, because most real deaths were agricultural, hidden, in shadows rather than sung in poems. You watch as the cows shuffle closer, as if drawn by instinct to the dying man. Their heavy breathing fills the room like a strange chorus. The elder's daughter wipes his brow, whispering softly, while the youngest child asks in a hushed voice if he'll be taken to Valhalla. The mother doesn't answer. You suspect she's thinking what you are. Warriors die in glory, but farmers fade away quietly, their stories absorbed into the rhythm of barns and fields. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some folklore claimed that cows could sense approaching death, lowing mournfully when someone in the household was near the end. Looking at the herd tonight, their restless shifting feels eerie, as though they know more than the humans do. The air thickens with smoke and silence. You think about how many generations ended like this, men and women breathing their last among the animals they depended on. No saga poet to record it, no monument raised, just the steady sound of chewing, the faint warmth of hides, the smell of dung and hay mingling with the last sighs of the dying. And yet there's a strange peace to it. No battlefield chaos, no sudden axe blow, just the barn, the family, and the cows. Death as a continuation of daily life. You smile faintly at the irony. Raiders feared dying at sea, but farmers found comfort in dying at home, under the same beams that sheltered them from their first breath. Humor slips in quietly, because it always does. The youngest child, perhaps not understanding the solemnity, asks if the cows will remember grandfather. Another chuckles and replies, only if he owed them hay. The family manages a tired laugh, and even you feel the heaviness lift for a moment. The elder exhales one last time softly, like a sigh carried away on smoke. The family bows their heads. The cows chew on, steady and eternal, as though nothing has changed. And in truth, for them, nothing has. Tomorrow they will still need fodder, still low impatiently, still demand the same labor. Life continues indifferent to human endings. You step outside into the cold night, drawing in the sharp air. The stars scatter above the fjord, distant and silent. Behind you, the barn glows faintly, a cradle of both life and death. And you realize that while sagas glorified warriors, the real Viking deaths, the majority, were quieter, ending not in Valhalla, but beneath the beams of a barn, with cows as the final companions. The evening lies heavy over the valley, the fjord glimmering with streaks of silver light as the sun sinks behind jagged cliffs. You walk slowly toward the pasture, your boots crunching on frost-hardened earth. The cows drift like shadows across the dim fields, their lowing carrying through the still air. After everything, the hayfield quarrels, the plagues, the rituals, the endless chores, this final sight feels softer. The herd moves together in twilight, a chorus of silhouettes fading into the night. The barn door stands ajar, firelight spilling out in a warm stripe across the frozen ground. Inside, families murmur, their voices tired but steady. You pause outside, preferring the silence of the field. Here, in the hush of dusk, the cows look almost spectral, their bodies pale against the dark. You realize that the fear they once inspired has shifted into something gentler. The horns that threaten now seem like familiar crowns, the heavy bodies like guardians keeping vigil. One mainstream historical fact: Norse poetry often compared herds to armies, describing cows as troops that gave strength to the household. The herd was both a symbol of power and a measure of stability. Historians still argue whether these poetic images were meant as metaphor or reflected genuine reverence, but standing here, you understand why the comparison mattered. To a Viking farmer, cows were soldiers in the war against winter. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. In some folk tales, cows seen wandering in twilight were thought to be accompanied by spirits, as if ancestors themselves walked beside the herd. You glance again at the shadows and almost believe it. The air feels thick, timeless, as though every step the cows take echoes with centuries of footsteps before them. The herd shifts, moving slowly toward the barn, hooves crunching, breath steaming. You feel yourself drifting with them, lulled by the rhythm. The chores, the fears, the endless debates, all dissolve in the steady procession of animals returning to shelter. You breathe in deeply, the smell of hay and frost mingling, and let the tension slip from your shoulders. The longhouse waits ahead, but you linger in the twilight, watching the herd vanish into darkness. You understand now why Viking farmers feared their cows more than raids. Not because raids weren't terrifying, but because cows demanded attention every day, shaping every breath of survival. And in the end, that daily wait mattered more than any fleeting glory at sea. The sky deepens, stars blinking awake. The cows fade into shadow, their low voices like a lullaby carried on the cold air. You close your eyes, letting the rhythm of their breathing wrap around you. The fear that once clung to every hoofprint softens into something steadier. Respect, familiarity, even comfort. You turn slowly back toward the barn, the glow of firelight calling you home. The herd has settled, the night is quiet, and your own steps feel lighter now, as though the long saga of cows and fear has led not to dread, but to calm. Now the story softens, and so does your breath. You imagine yourself lying on a straw bed. Inside the longhouse, the fire crackling low, shadows stretching like gentle waves across the rafters. The cows nearby breathe deeply, their steady rhythm matching your own. Each sound, chewing hay, a tail swishing, a soft sigh, becomes part of a slow lullaby. Outside, the fjord is still. The water reflects the stars as though the sky has spilled into its depths. The mountains stand silent, their sharp edges softened by snow, holding the valley in a quiet embrace. You feel the weight of winter, but it no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a blanket, tucking the world in for sleep. You let your mind wander back over what you've seen, the hayfields and the feuds, the songs sung to cows in the dark, the laughter woven into even the hardest days. All of it threads together into a single rhythm, steady and slow. The rhythm of daily life, of survival, of people and animals bound together. The fears that once pressed on you, the horns of bulls, the cough of a sick calf, the threat of empty haylofts, begin to dissolve. What remains is softer, the glow of firelight, the warmth of bodies nearby, the comfort of knowing that tomorrow will bring the same rhythm again. Work, yes. Worry, yes. But also continuity, something steady you can trust. The cows shift once, moor their hooves brushing straw, and then the longhouse settles into silence. You feel your own body mirror that calm, breath deepening, shoulders sinking. The saga has ended, but the lullaby continues, carrying you gently into sleep. Good night.